Hi, so my name's Jane. I'm what I would call an HIV veteran of 30 years. I'm not that comfortable with the word survivor.
Okay.
I don't know that I've actually survived. I'm still living with HIV, so I find the word veteran a lot more empowering. And I guess, you know, it's not a war. It was a war, but it's not a battle anymore. But so veteran feels very comfortable with me. So I was diagnosed with HIV in 1990. At that time I was living in Tanzania in East Africa, and quite a surreal experience. I guess living in a developing country in those days was it was an amazing experience. It was just like living a dream for me. I loved it. It was a beautiful place. AIDS wasn't really something talked about, and it was called AIDS in those days, so let's just call it what it was then. And really was a distant thing in America with gay men. Where I lived in Tanzania, there was one radio station, there was no TV station, and one newspaper, and they were in Swahili. So we didn't hear much about what was going on. I worked in the tourism sector, so we did hear stuff through the tourists. But I did start to see some of the guys that I was working with. Sort of a very natural thing to happen was somebody would get TB, and 6 weeks later they would die. And this was happening quite consistently and quite alarmingly. And I always remember my first experience of seeing somebody with AIDS. It was one of the guys that worked for us. He'd been very, very sick. He had TB, and I went to his house. He lived literally in a mud hut in a small village, and I guess, you know, maybe from the 80s people might remember seeing pictures on TV of Africa in the AIDS epidemic. Well, this was exactly that. A man, a huge man. He was a very tall man at one point, but he was just a shell of himself. His head was huge, his hands were huge, his feet were huge, and everything else was really small. And I remember going up and touching him. I mean, I'd guessed it was AIDS. I wasn't sure. Everyone was saying it was TB, but it was like, this wasn't TB. And I remember him looking at my hand and the fear in his eyes, and it was almost like he was saying to me, don't touch me because you'll get this. And I don't know if that's what he was saying, but that's the look of fear in his eyes, and it was like a pleading to sort of like, don't touch, don't touch. And he passed away, and it was really interesting. The other guys that we worked with would not call it AIDS. It was TB. So I guess I knew somewhere that AIDS was in Tanzania, but I still hadn't really thought about it for myself. I got a phone call from a very good friend of mine to tell me that an ex-partner had died, and that he died of salmonella, typhoid and AIDS, and so that I probably should get tested. Well, to even get tested in Tanzania at that time was difficult, because they were in denial that they even had it in the country. So I managed to find a Dutch mission hospital, and went down into the, still quite emotional even after 30 years, to the laboratory to find somebody that could do an HIV test. I was quite surprised, because he said you'd need to have some counselling, and I thought that was quite progressive. He walked me up these 7 flights of stairs to this little room where a little Dutch nun in her white habit, who sort of told me about HIV and all the rest of it. I forgot to mention that they had taken the test, and then I went for the counselling. So she was going to tell me the results, and so she took a half an hour telling me about what AIDS was and what was going to happen, and she didn't really tell me that I had it. So in the end I said to her, so have I got it? And she said yes. And I don't know that I can really describe what that was like. I was sitting in this room on the 7th floor looking out over Lake Victoria, which is the most stunning view. The African sun, you could see to the horizon. It was the most perfect day, and yet inside this room all I could hear was like my heart beating and darkness. I felt darkness, you know, and her word, you know, I sort of said, well, what do I do? And she said, well, don't have sex anymore and eat well and rest. And I sort of said, well, how long will I have? And she said, well, you know, at that point, it had been 2 years since I'd been with my ex-partner, so she said, well, you've had it for 2 years, and maybe another 3 years. So I walked home, and again, it was just very surreal in this beautiful, beautiful African day, the African smells. And I don't even know that I can describe the fear. The fear was, I mean, I don't know, maybe a little bit. If you thought about, you know, you're walking down a dark alley at night time by yourself and you can hear footsteps behind, and how everything kind of sharpens and the adrenaline drums in your head and your heart's beating. Or if you've ever been sitting at home, you know, at home at night time and you think someone's breaking in, and you know, the pounding. And so I walked home in that kind of state. It was a zombie. And I had to go home and tell my partner. I'd been with a new partner for 2 years. He took it quite well, really. I think his words were, you know, why the fuck don't you be careful who you sleep with? And he buggered off and went off and got drunk. Didn't come home for hours. I had, at that time, my son was 6 years old. And I just remember looking at him going, well, you know, I'm not even going to see you be 10 years old. I'm not going to see you grow up. That first night, I think I must have woken. I don't know that I slept. I think every time I dozed off, I woke up. And I literally sat up in bed. I think I thought I was going to die in my sleep, you know. I'm not sure that I was so scared of death for myself, but, you know, I had a son, you know, all these visions of what AIDS looked like. And I remember my partner saying to me, you know, you're no different today than you were yesterday. And I said, yeah, I am. Yesterday I had the possibility of a lifetime. Today I've got maybe 3 years. And I've got, you know, a 6-year-old son. So I guess, you know, at that time there were no medications. And so that I think was the fear. It was like there was nothing. This was death. You know, it was. Sometimes I hear, you know, I hear things about Ebola, and I think, you know, I think AIDS was the 80s Ebola. I know myself that if I had to go to a country that had Ebola, I would be petrified. I would be, and so I understood why people would be frightened of me. My partner said to me, "Don't tell anybody. We keep this to ourselves." Unfortunately, he had to get tested, and he was also positive, so we were both positive. But we don't tell anybody. They'll think, you know, they'll think I'm probably a fag, or we're both drug addicts or something. And, you know, so we kept it quiet. One of the things we did do, and it was very easy to keep it quiet in a country like Tanzania. Nobody talked about it. The stigma was profound, and it was. So you just held on to that because you're too scared to tell anybody. Which was hard for me. I'm a person that needs to share and talk. Luckily, because, you know, my friends had phoned me to tell me about my ex-partner, so of course they had followed, kept ringing, you know what. So I was able to talk to them, but they weren't in the same town. So at one point, my partner and I decided that I would go to England and just see what was available in England. We'd heard, I think, little rumours about AZT, and so I thought, well, I'll go and get us the pills and come back, and went to England and did link in with some medical services, but AZT wasn't available. and so I sort of went back to Tanzania. We kind of plodded on for a couple of years, and I think that those 3 years, it was, I mean, I started to lose a lot of weight. You know, just everything that you know, this is AIDS. This is what happens when you've got AIDS. But on looking back on it now, I think it was depression. I mean, I did go into huge depression. I guess, you know, when there's no hope, there just doesn't seem to be any hope. And anyway, we ended up going back to England. My partner's job finished and we went back to England, and it was around that time that Freddie Mercury died, and I always remember that. It was my first experience of somebody famous, of somebody else publicly dying from. And I think for me that was, again, it was like, so, you know, someone who's famous dies. You know, if you were famous, you'd have enough money to buy the best medicines and all, and somebody famous can't do that. So, you know, this is your life. This is what you're going to do. So going to England was really good in that we were able to link into networks. So for me, what was really, I think that helped, a few things that, you know, I often think about why, you know, 30 years, how did I survive? Why did I survive? Why did I live? Why didn't I die? I don't think I have survivor's guilt. I'm quite, I'm glad, I was glad that I was alive. That's changing a little bit as I get older. But at the time, you know, I'm glad that I have lived the last 30 years, that I have seen my son get married. I have 2 grandchildren. I'm glad I've been there for all of that. So I don't have survivor's guilt. I do wonder why. I sort of think, why do some people live and some people don't? And so many people died. I don't really understand that. My partner has also lived, so obviously whatever strain we have is something that we've been able to live with. You know, the most significant thing for me as far as support, and when I went to England, I enrolled in a support group and became very involved in support. Even at that time, there was still no medication. So, and by that time, I'd been positive for but I'd been diagnosed for about just over 3.5 years. So, you know, I hadn't died yet. The counselling and support networks, and I mean, I work in that field now, and I work in it because I believe in it. Beside my son, wanting to be alive for my son, I think it was counselling and support networks that got me through as well. I think finally, when we were able to get onto AZT, that was a game changer. Yep. The drugs may not have been that great, but it gave you hope. And I think that's what people need some hope. And my CD4 had gone down to about 280, and the doctor said, well, you know, there's this, it's a trial, we're not sure. So the choice was, well, it's this or certain death, so I'm going to try. There was no, my partner wouldn't, he didn't. He was in denial, and that was the struggle for us, because he wouldn't talk about it. So support, as in counselling, was important. The other thing that was very, I was very aware of, I guess, in those days, was that wherever I went, I was the only woman. A lot of the support places, there were gay men, and I remember at the time that made me feel a little bit like, oh, I must be really bad. You know, it's like women don't really obviously get this, so it's sort of like, yeah. I mean, I do remember feeling very poisonous all those years. My relationship split up, and I came back to New Zealand, and I came back because I thought I was going to die, and still at that stage. I'd been 4 years since diagnosis. I thought I'd better bring my son back to be with my family so that when I died, he had support. And I guess the biggest turnaround in the HIV history was their antiretrovirals. And that was, I think, if I recollect, in '96, I started on antiretrovirals. And I think it was at that point that I started to think more than 6 months at a time. I think that was the huge, and even then, I mean, they were new, so we didn't know that they were going to be as successful as they are. There were a lot of side effects, you know, lipodystrophy, lipoatrophy, but they were worth it. They kept me alive. They kept me there for my son. Support networks, even when I came back, I straight away got into that 12-on-12 groups, and people were a lot more engaged in support, and I think that was probably more out of fear too. I have noticed, you know, in the time that I've worked in support networks, that people don't seem to need the support in today as they did 15, 20 years ago. I think HIV is not so scary anymore, and it's not a death sentence anymore anyway. So, you know, in saying that, you know, I've been with people who've been newly diagnosed, and it's still shattering. And stigma is still a huge barrier. I think life after ARVs, well, like I said, I started thinking about, a year in advance. I went back and studied. I started thinking about a career. I started, you know, planning a bit more for the future. So, but in saying that, you know, HIV still has played a huge impact on my personal life. Since leaving my partner in England, it's been 24 years now, I've chosen to stay single. In the earlier days when I came back to New Zealand, it was because I was going to die, so what was the point? And I didn't want to be with somebody who was going to have to look after me. And I was very, I mean, the real honest truth about that is that I was afraid of rejection. And, you know, I didn't want to have to tell people, I didn't want to be rejected. I was relatively insecure before I had HIV, so adding HIV to the mix, I totally had no confidence in myself. And I lost my sexuality, I feel. I lost the fact that I felt sexual, or that I had the right to feel that. And in the beginning, it was quite deliberate, but as time has gone on, and so you know, it's a 24-year side effect, I think, of the psychological side effect that I still feel even now, and I'm public about being HIV positive, so it's not about, you know, I don't think I could do a relationship. And that's ironic, because I tell all the people that we support that yes, you can, and it's, you know, and I know that you can, but it is definitely something that has changed my life, HIV. I mean, HIV, I'm not one of these people that would say, you know, I'm glad I got it, because, you know, all these wonderful things have happened to me since, and I've grown as a person. I have grown as a person, and I'm the sort of person that would look at the silver lining rather than it being wonderful. You know, HIV is not a nice thing to have, and if you can avoid it, avoid it. But you know, it is different now, and I'm so glad about that. I mean, the drugs are there. We can now have, you know, unprotected sex while on medications of undetectable viral load. I mean, that's just a whole game changer. If I were to talk to a young woman in Tanzania or even in New Zealand now, you know, I find that quite difficult. I'm not the sort of person, believe it or not, I don't tell people what to do. I don't think there's one shoe fits all. I think everybody reacts differently. I do encourage people to go to counselling or to get some peer support. I think nobody knows better than someone else in a similar situation about what you're going through, and it's really, I've found it empowering to link into support networks, and I've found it really beneficial to go to counselling. So I would offer that as a starting point for, you know, I mean, it's not everybody likes peer support, not everybody likes counselling, but that's what I found worked for me, and, you know, I guess that's what I would suggest about might be a first place to go. I know a lot of people kind of say things like, oh, it's not a death sentence anymore and you'll live fine. I think that kind of negates what's going on for that person right at that time. If I put myself right back, you know, into that little hospital room in Mwanza on the 7th floor with the nun, and the impact that that diagnosis had on me and how I felt, yes, it's changed, but I think people still feel that impact. I think people still feel that shock, they fear, and so I think you need to acknowledge that and let people feel that. I think getting a diagnosis like HIV, you do go through a grieving process. The person I was before HIV is not the same person after. And you have to learn to live a new way. And we can do that. It's possible, but grieving is a process, and I think we need to allow ourselves time to go through that process. Growing old with HIV is actually quite a scary thing for me. I think growing old is a scary thing. I just turned 61 last month. I've struggled with it. I think more so than, not more so, but more so at this time than the HIV. I'm a full supporter of euthanasia or assisted, you know, and I would not want to be sitting in a retirement home with dementia or with someone afraid to touch me because I've got AIDS or HIV or whatever. You know, and I have seriously looked into alternatives overseas where I would feel quite comfortable now. I know that sounds crazy when I wanted to live 30 years ago, whereas now, you know, I'm not saying right at this point, but by the time I get a little bit older, I would be quite okay just to go to bed and take a little concoction and not wake up. I would, you know, I think the idea of going into a cared facility is scary. I think most people probably find that. I think we all would prefer, most people would prefer to live in their own home until they die. I would hope that could happen. I guess, you know, if I am in that situation, I guess it's, I kind of identify it as like being in hospital, I suppose. So it's like, what do I want from those people, or what would I like them to, how would I like them to treat people living with HIV is obviously with dignity and respect. And, you know, I guess it's important to educate staff in nursing in homes or in retirement villages, you know, especially now with undetectable viral loads, meaning that we can't transmit. You know, people need to understand that they're not going to contract anything by touching us. So I guess I'd want those people to be educated, and I think people can. I mean, you know, I've been very lucky throughout my 30 years is that I haven't had too much discrimination, and I take opportunities to educate people, and I think as positive people, rather than being angry at people because they have a certain attitude towards us, I use that as an opportunity to educate. And when I've done that, I've found most people are very receptive. So, you know, we can be proactive ourselves in that. We can, if we're in a nursing home and we find that we're not being treated the way we want to be treated, then, you know, address it. You know, go to one of the support services, ask them to advocate. But I guess as a community, I think it'd be good for us to get in there and educate. Aged care is scary for me. I guess it's, you know, it's a really good question. I think it's about a lack of, a loss of control. And I think that's one of the things I found very difficult when I contracted HIV, or when I was diagnosed. My life was out of my control, is what I felt. Of course you can regain control in a different way, but in those early days I was in a situation where I was going to die and there was nothing I could do about it, except maybe, you know, live what time I had left to the best. So I think when I think about living in an age-concerned place where other people are going to be telling me what time to eat my meal and turn the lights off and wipe my bum for me, that's scary. I don't want that. I don't want that lack of control. I decided I wanted to share my story today to support the project. You know, and there's some people doing it that I really like and admire and want to support them. But alongside that, I think the topic is, I think it's a really relevant topic. I think I'm not one of these people that kind of goes around saying, oh, you know, in the old days this and the old days that. I mean, the old days were not that bloody good. And I don't think we need to rub young people's noses into like, hey, you need to appreciate what we've been through. No, why would an 18-year-old even understand what I went through? But I think it's good to have a record so that people, you know, go back in history and can go, okay, that's what it was like. And so I think it's important to record those things. What makes me happy? I'd say being with my grandchildren and with my son. Very cliche, I suppose, but they make me happy, spending time with them. And the other time where I feel, I don't know that I feel happy, but where I feel, I think for me it's very important to have a purpose in life. And in the work that I do, when I see somebody who we connect with, who's just been newly diagnosed and who feels that their life is at the end, and then to see that same person a couple of years later, married with children, and that, yeah, it makes me happy, and that's why I'm crying. It makes me feel glad. Yeah. I guess during my time at Positive Women, there's lots of things that I feel proud of, that as an organisation, that we've supported women. You know, women are a minority in New Zealand, and as a result are further isolated. And I guess some of the saddest things that I've seen have been women, refugee and migrant women, who've come to New Zealand with a whole lot of hope for a new start, and then on arrival here find that they're diagnosed with HIV. And that, you know, they've all really come from a lot of toughness, and then to have that thrown on the top. And I remember once in Christchurch, I went to Christchurch. It's when it first started, and the counsellors there had organised a group to meet with a group of women. There were about 5 African women. And they were totally isolated. They hadn't spoken to other women who were positive. And I remember one woman in particular, she was very thin, she'd lost a lot of weight, and she was very gaunt. And what I've seen with African women, when they get sort of that sort of AIDS, their skin has a little pale translucentness around, and her hair wasn't that kept. And you know, African women love to do their hair. And she was so sad, and this group was so sad. You know, everybody was crying, and it was sad. Anyway, those women, this one in particular that I was telling you about, but within 2 years, she was just a totally different woman. She had all her wigs on, and she'd put on a bit of weight, and she was laughing, and you know, and I would go and visit quite regularly those women, and they connected with each other, and the transformation in those women, and they were laughing, and it just, to me, that was, yeah, special.